All right, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. I get the pleasure of introducing Nick Shimon today. While serving as director for most of his library career, Nick has always had community connection as a focus. Ensuring that the library becomes a center for building community is one of his passions, and he's here today to talk to you about how you can make that a reality in your town. Take it away, Nick.
Hello. I'm going to share my screen here for a second. Um, I'm getting over a cold, so you get to have me in sort of a bass mode, like baritone, speaking today. Okay, can everybody see that okay, I hope? I turned off chat because I'm also very
Yeah, yes, it
distractible.
it looks great.
Okay, so I'm going to hop right in. Thank you, Becky, for the introduction. Um, I'm here. Uh, I got this right on my screen. There we go. So I'm going to just jump right in. In May last year, the Surgeon General issued the advisory of the epidemic of loneliness in the country. In that advisory, the Surgeon General laid out the direct health effects that come from the increasing separation that all of our people in our communities are experiencing. The advisory outlines the negative effects of the epidemic, but also talks about 6 pillars to overcome it. Sitting right there in the very first pillar, he advises investing in local institutions that bring people together, like libraries, parks, and in green spaces. So in this, we have the ability and the calling to directly affect a positive emotional and physical impact on our communities. I want to read a section of the advisory because it really hits home to me, and actually the first couple times I've read it out loud, the first couple times I read it out loud, it kind of makes me messed up and that sort of thing. So he says, people began to tell me that they felt isolated, invisible, and insignificant. Even when they couldn't put their finger on the word lonely, time and time again, people of all ages and socioeconomic backgrounds from every corner of the country would tell me, I have to shoulder all of life's burdens by myself, or if I disappear tomorrow, no one will even notice. Loneliness is far more than just a bad feeling. It harms both individual and societal health. It is associated with a greater risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and premature death. Given the profound consequences of loneliness and isolation, we have an opportunity and an obligation to make the same investments in addressing social connection that we have made in addressing tobacco use, obesity, and the addiction crisis. If we fail to do so, we will pay an ever increasing price in the form of our individual and collective health and well being. And we will continue to splinter and divide until we can no longer stand as a community or as a country. Instead of coming together to take on the great challenges before us, we will further retreat into our corners, angry, sick, and alone. So that it concludes that, and like I said, that just really resonates with me. And um, we talk a lot about in libraries about connecting to the community and working with community partners, community entities. But members of our community are no longer participating in those groups, the social entities that exist. So here we're going to take a more active role, and I cannot get rid of this. There we go. Um, we're going to look at building the community directly itself. Um, and while that was a very heavy hitting statement, I'm extremely positive about this because this is something that we can help with directly. This is something that we can really have an impact on. And we are also already equipped with the programs, the events to handle this. So to provide a little bit of history on this, how the sense of community affects health is a relatively new discussion, at least in regards to Western medicine. There is some there's community focus, and it's used to resolve a lot of problems in many cultures around the world. So this is kind of a problem that we've created ourselves. The field of the social epidemiology dates back to about 1950. The term was coined around then, and then there's been sporadic study through the 90s and early 2000s. While this kind of encompasses what I'm talking about, the field primary has looked at the effects of socioeconomic status, like discrimination in economic status, like how much money somebody has in regards to the effects on health. As you can imagine, how much money you have, direct discrimination policies can have a sizable effect on health. The effect of belonging and community with direct link to health started to become a little bit more popular in the 2000s. I became aware of it heavily when Dan Buettner published the book The Blue Zones in 2008, and then began the Blue Zone Project shortly after. For those of you who have been around long enough, you may have seen Mr. Buettner speak at the 2012 ILA conference as a keynote speaker. And he then began, he began the Blue Zones project shortly after. Um, the Blue Zones identified the communities around the world who had the longest lifespans. They said, okay, let's see what these communities share and how can we try and promote these elsewhere. They came up with 9 attributes that they found to be the central points of each of these. There are the 3 that are food related, eating till we feel not quite full, about 80%. They focused on primarily a vegetarian diet. They didn't identify as vegetarian. That's just what they happened to have nearby. They had vegetables, fruit, legumes. So that's what they ate. They tended to treat meat as sort of a side rather than a focus. And for those wine lovers out there, they tended to drink a glass of wine a day. And they called that wine at 5. They moved naturally, not exercising, but moving as part of their day, like biking or walking to wherever they needed to go, grocery stores, schools, to work, that sort of thing. And they allowed time to downshift mentally, whether that be meditation or prayer, etc. But 4 of the 9 focused on a sense of belonging, family, social networks, religion. The people in these communities had a reason to get up in the morning. They had people to connect with, and they felt like they were part of a group. Um, the Blue Zone book expanded into the Blue Zone Project, looking to bring, like I said, these benefits to the communities across the country. Dan Buettner is a resident of the Twin Cities up in Minnesota, so they ran the pilot in Albert Lea, which many of you may be familiar with as being just north of our border. If you travel up that way, of course, it's the home of the TA stop, where you kind of just have to stop on your way up to the Twin Cities. In 2014, Cedar Falls, Spencer, Waterloo, and Mason City were selected as the pilot Blue Zone communities in Iowa, with more being selected soon after. I know in our area, I believe Iowa City is, and I know Cedar Rapids and Marion are. There was a whole statewide effort that involved then Governor Branstad and the Blue Zone Project trying to make Iowa the healthiest state in the country. We didn't make it. We are 15th currently, but we did move up. So, bonus points. However, unfortunately, while we did kind of understand what would make us better, the projects, the work on the Blue Zone and the acknowledgement of what makes people live longer did not mark a turnaround in social connection. From the Surgeon General's advisory on loneliness and isolation, the trend worsened. This means everything from, in these graphs, spending more time alone, less engagement with members in our own homes, and less time of feeling companionship. You can see big drop-offs here, less time engaging with friends, less time spent engaging with family outside of our household, our extended families, and less time just engaging with others in general. These squares that you'll see in the graph are called pivot points. Those are identified points at which they have major turnarounds. You'll notice that these are maybe not where you expect them to be. One of the major pivot points is 2008 to 2010, which they identify as being where the recession of 2008 hit and people just didn't have money to get out. The other general pivot point is around 2013 and 2014, and there's no real major event that marks why this may have occurred at this time. There's a lot of conjecture that this is the point at which about half the people in the country had social media and smartphones. There's a lot of studies on the correlation between social media and loneliness, but nothing that shows direct causation. But people who are discussing this definitely kind of are side-eyeing this, and it actually comes up in the advisory itself. And this lack of belonging and feeling of loneliness causes direct health problems. We're not talking just about feeling sad. It increases the risk of premature death by 25%. It increases risk of heart disease by 29%. Increases risk of stroke by 32%. It increases risk of anxiety, depression, dementia, and just of being more susceptible to viruses and bacteria in and of itself. This affects about half of our population. So 1 in every 2 people have voiced the feeling of loneliness. This is the health risk that is affecting our community, our staff, our friends, our families. Compare this to half of the people you know smoking 3/4 of a pack of cigarettes a day. That's how dangerous this is. To combat this epidemic, the Surgeon General did issue 6 main points to turn this around. And as I mentioned, immediately in the first pillar sits the public library, where people can gather and connect. And while I'm here to talk mostly about library events, I did want to touch on a couple of the other pillars, the main points, because some of you are directors, managers, and leaders, and so I think some of those are popular or are important. So the second pillar is pro-connection policies. I want to make the point that that it's important to understand that our library policies can and do affect connection and our ability and the people's ability to use our buildings. Fines and fees are barriers for many people in our community. Fine of a few dollars may mean no longer being able to use our materials. Meeting room fees mean some people can't use them to connect with others. One of the first conversations that I ever had in Iowa was when I moved into my home, talked to my neighbor. His daughter was not allowed to go to the library anymore because she wasn't allowed to use the library anymore because she had fines that they couldn't pay. I also want to make a big point that our collections and services have to reflect all of the members of our community. In the current atmosphere in Iowa, we have a minority of people focusing on telling other members of our community that their lives are not okay, whether that's through book banning or other social policies. We have to take our buildings and show that all are welcome within our walls, and that can make a huge difference in somebody's life. Pillar 4 is reevaluating technology. As I mentioned, this is something that a lot of people are kind of connecting to this problem. We have to look at how we use it and work. And they also want to get more information from social media companies about how they work and operate. You can only have so much of a reach here. As a personal recommendation, I'd seriously evaluate how you yourself are using social media, and at the very least, turning off your notifications. Understand that these social media companies make their money from you scrolling and keeping you scrolling so that you see more ads, and they're good at it. They have teams upon teams of people working every day, all day at this. That scrolling takes you away from friends and family. And I'm not saying you can leave the platforms. I'm not sure we're able to do that at this point, either in our personal or work lives. But set specific times where you check them. Likewise, set boundaries for work and let your staff set boundaries for work. Let them know that there are times when they don't have to be available. If somebody happens to be required to be available in the case of emergencies, make sure you learn to delay emails from being sent until they work next, so they're not trying to respond and answer questions. The last in the sixth pillar he outlines is promoting a culture of connection. Basically, as librarians, continue to model kindness and respect and the commitment to one another that I know you're already doing. But also, I wanted to put a plug in. If you have staff, let them define connection at work. They're going to work more productively if they have somebody that they're looking forward to seeing every day. Also, allow them to put their family first. Let them attend family events and let them put their family needs as a priority. Finding replacements and rescheduling is a pain. I completely understand. I've been there. But a happier staff is more productive. I've argued with city administrations and city councils for many years, talking about how people would be more productive if we had more holidays, if we had more vacation time. And, they're just dead set on the fact that matching the community next to you is all you need. Even if that culture that we have is bound and determined to have people plug away at their desks and have their quality and quantity of work decrease. So that's my soapbox. So that all acting as a background, let's start talking about connection as a part of library events. I've generally tried to organize this into four primary parts, and then we're going to look at some events and testing that I've done throughout my career, as what works and what doesn't. Um, the first part is, of course, knowing who to focus on, who to target as part of these events. Um, to really get to know this, you have to do your strategic planning. Talk to Becky about this because I know she's who I learned how to do this from. So I'll put that plug in for Becky. You have to use both statistics and you have to talk to people directly. I'm going to use the North Liberty statistics directly here, and show how this both works and doesn't work. If you look at this, I know North Liberty is a little bit of an outlier in the state. We're very heavily on young parents and kids. You can see those spikes in the 20 to 50, and then in the kid range. If you look just at this, you think we need to focus just on these populations, or primarily on these populations, because these make up such a large part of our population. What we've been found, we just finished a series of focus groups, and what they told us in one of those is that we actually have the community filling in with the 55 plus age demographic. What we think is happening is basically, as people are getting older, they're needing to downsize. And when you downsize, who are you going to move next to? You're going to move next to your kids and your grandkids. Many of them have recently lost a spouse, which probably triggered that need to downsize. So we're talking about people who are moving to the area that are new, many of whom have lost a spouse, two things that are the most isolating things that you can think of. Not maybe most, but they're two very isolating things. So when you're doing your strategic planning, you have to talk to people, like sit down with focus groups, have town meetings, get a wide spread of your community to know what's going on. In many towns, the population is aging, so some of your most isolated people may be younger. When I moved to Iowa, I could not tell you another 20-something person living in that town. So that was definitely very isolating. The next part of creating events is, when aiming for social connection, be lenient on attendance. In the past, I've been a director, and I feel that tug to really get those program numbers to show off to your city and county officials, to show those impressive programming counts. When you're aiming to connect people, you're not necessarily aiming to knock things out of the park with participants. In many cases, you'll actually need and want smaller groups for this to work as intended. You need people to connect, and that doesn't happen when there's a ton of people. And in some cases, designing the programs themselves will work better when you have a smaller participation set. Next, you need repetition. People need multiple connections to create familiarity, where I'm talking about like actual physical brain connections. On average, it takes about 10 experiences to form the neural pathway for familiarity. It becomes an actual physical thing within your brain. I will say that in my events, there's definite room for improvement here. And while it takes 10 experiences to form a connection pathway, it doesn't take more than a few minutes or a few seconds even to form that exposure. And I'm going to use the example of thinking of how we form connections at our conferences. You sit somebody next to somebody at a breakfast, you see them at a couple sessions, and the next thing you know, you're connected on LinkedIn. If you happen to go out to the same place for dinner and you see them for breakfast the next morning, the next thing you know about their dog or their kids, and you're connected on Facebook, and you're wishing them happy birthday. Again, I'm talking here about social media, and we talked about how that's problematic. So there you go. So length isn't important. It's more about the number. Unfortunately, a 45-minute discussion still does not count for the experiences. It really just counts as like one or two, in general terms. Since it's repetition and the purpose is connection, while this sounds like a big undertaking, the programs don't have to be um, a huge deal. Um, this can also help offset programming numbers with the repetition, since even if you get just 5 people, 5 people a week is still 20 people a month, which is a pretty decent single event. And the last item is intention, and to be intentional with what you're doing in regards to social connection. How you make your invitations, how you advertise, how you set up the room, all matter when you're talking about providing social connection. WebJunction has a webinar that they have done on this topic, and they focus heavily on intention. And if you really want to delve into that, the Bible of the topic is called The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. It's a wonderful book for anybody who looks to host social gatherings or events. She has way more information on gathering than I can ever imagine I will ever have. Um, and I'll have a list of references at the end, so don't worry about too much about finding that at the moment. Depending on who you're looking to target, your ask may need to look different. You may need to directly ask the group of teen that come into the library to join your tag group or attend your craft session. Just toss some snacks out there. You say, hey, we have chips or pop, and like, oh, cool. With an adult event, you have to be a little bit more careful, or you have to be more, again, intentional. Young adults or new adults, the 20s and 30s, will probably be more likely to be attracted by, marketing blurb on Instagram, or because we spend so much time there, or a bookmark inserted into the latest checkout. You may need to make this a little bit more something. Understand that with the young adult population, and not young adult, the new adult population, if they have kids, they may need to find care. They have the same home needs that you do, so you have to overcome those in order to get those that population into your community. With older adults, you may need to alter what you're doing. You may need to go to them, assisted living facilities, senior gatherings, and these might be more simple. We have a regular group who come in and would be happy and are happy with very mediocre coffee, some cookies, and if you let them play cards together, or chess. We have a number of chess players as well. And then, like I said, you put thought into how you arrange your space to foster connection among the participants. We found that some events don't actually work purely because of the setup limits. Our painting events are very, very, very popular, but just because of the act of painting, you need arm room to move around, and that actually physically distances people. So it just doesn't work. We're still going to do them, of course, because people really like doing them. But for social connection, it's just not an ideal program. So I'm going to go through the age groups as ideas for how to foster social connection as a part of library events and programming. I'm going to start with youth. As a caveat, I've worked typically with the adult population. Throughout my entire career, I've been very fortunate to have stellar youth librarians. So I have absorbed mostly through osmosis and from my own children. What I've taken from my work on this, as well as researching how to be a parent, the biggest effect on children is their connection with their parents and their family and their caregivers. I'm not going to get into programs since that's not what this is about, and other people can talk about children's events much better than I can. And since that's not looking at fostering social connection, that doesn't really fit in here. However, since children rely on their adults for their early development, efforts to improve parents and caregivers likewise do benefit those youth. So it's kind of a 2-for-1. It's the same tenet that everybody always talks about, which is the the aircraft oxygen mask coming down. You have to put your own on. You have to take care of yourself before you can take care of somebody else. When we get to the teen and the tween area, we start to look a little bit more at community directly, at socialization, because that's where they start trying to connect with each other as a community. With this population, often just having a place to go and socialize is great. Many of these people in our community don't actually feel like they belong anywhere. Some of them don't feel like they belong in their own homes. So having the library as a place where they can go and belong is enough to make them feel like they have something. Um, with this population, you do sometimes have to compete with school events, with sports, but understand that there are definitely youth who don't fit into those sports, band, and science groups. Try and pick those out and make sure that they have a place. I will comment on a couple a couple of events for the teens and tweens that I've done that I've seen work especially well for social connection. The first is I ran a Dungeons and Dragons campaign that stretched across multiple libraries and communities, which was extremely fun. I think it's the most fun thing that I've ever done in libraries. And again, in terms of number of participants, at most you want 5 or 6 current people, because otherwise you're just not having enough time to interact as your own character, because you take turns, and if you have too many, it just doesn't work. It does take some time to prep a campaign. Any of us can do it. Don't be too intimidated by it. You have to contend a little bit with people who have never played and who are interested versus those who are experienced but maybe don't have anybody else to share this hobby. I love Dungeons and Dragons, have never known anybody else who's played. This is a great societal activity because people who are involved are directly working together to solve problems, and it involves direct social interaction. It lets them explore who they are, and it provides them with a temporary escape from their day-to-day stresses. And this works great for any age, typically young adult, just because of the popularity. We're riding a bump, of course, we're riding a bump of popularity from Stranger Things, because D&D is so much of a part of that show. And my favorite library story in the course of 17 years has come from this Dungeons and Dragons campaign. And if we're at the end and anybody wants to hear it, I'm happy to tell that, but I will skip that for right now. We also had a very active Girls on the Run program in West Branch. And then immediately, of course, we had the boys ask us what they want, but what they called Boys on the Run. I've been a part of the running community for many years. So there was a elementary teacher that was also interested in working on this, and together we kind of developed a program, and I'm going to loosely use the term develop, a program that met every week that taught teamwork, togetherness, while adapting a Couch to 5K program with the intent to be to finish the 5K at the end, which is what kind of the Girls on the Run system is as well. We didn't limit it to boys. It was welcome to whomever. But it was in West Branch, so we called it, which is, if you don't know, the birthplace of Herbert Hoover. So we called it Hoover's Movers. I didn't like the name, but we did get a logo that was a running Herbert Hoover, which was awesome. So I went with it, just for the logo itself. And over the weeks, those kids legitimately grew together. So it was really, really impressive. They got to find out things about one another that they didn't know through school. And by the end, they were legitimately working together to finish that 5K. And that can work with any age too. You maybe will teach different topics, or change how the topics would go, but forming that community around running is great. And it can work with hiking and walking as well. I particularly love the running community, because unless you're a top runner, it's really, the goal is just to finish. And if you can help somebody all along the way, it's all the better. I mean, if you're 7,001th versus 7,002th second, I'm sorry. It's a late part in the week. If you're in the 7,000s in finishing, your placement doesn't matter. It's just finishing. If you ever get a chance to root somebody on in a race, go do it. It's super fun. We were clear in this program that there was absolutely no recognition for finishing first. We said it week after week. Did not care who ran the fastest. And then when you get into the longer distances, we were clear, like sometimes you want to slow down in order to go faster. There was recognition for supporting one another. Um, and like I said, with Dungeons and Dragons, this sounds like a big endeavor, but we literally just mashed a couch to 5K program onto the top, onto discussions of teamwork, understanding, self-worth, that sort of thing. You can find tons of couch to 5K programs out there on the internet, and they all pretty much work the same way. We're going to move up in age to new adults. I'm going to say 20s and 30s, and we're going to talk about young parents. Um, for those who have or have had young children, you might identify with the idea that having children can be very, very isolating. You can't stay out past 7 maybe because of bedtimes. You have to be back at the house every couple of hours for nap time. So it's nearly impossible to keep up with connections during those years. We know story time is a great thing for literacy and socialization for kids, but I want to also toss it out as an idea, as a place where parents can connect. A day many, many years ago, our youth librarian came to me and said, "We have a problem with one of our story times." We have a problem, of course, is the director's favorite phrase. And I'm thinking, of course, is there a family that's disruptive? Is a child running around and causing destruction while their parent is not paying attention, which has always happened. She's like, no, our parents are being too loud. What we had was a regular group that came into the library for their social connection. And they did that every week. And they got a little loud. But they also continued to come for years. We're talking until their kids were in 5th and 6th grade, long after the typical story time age was passed. They even showed up when we didn't have story time. They took this concept of coming to the library when there wasn't story time and made their own book, took pictures, wrote a story, and then bound it. There's still a copy of this book at the West Branch Library if you want to read it. And I believe the oldest kids in that book are now in college. So that's how long ago that was. So I want to toss out the idea, if you have this group of parents, put out some coffee for them during story times, let them socialize. As I mentioned, with intentionality, you may have this group, as you can see here in this image, of them standing around in the back. But these parents aren't able to socialize because they're all separated. Do something within your environment to push them together. Naturally, story times are repetitive, so you tend to probably draw the same crowd week after week. I learned about this topic, another topic, in the book Palaces for the People. I did a quick survey of youth librarians, so I know this is kind of known. It's called Stay and Play, which is a program that is run right after story time, where you encourage the families to stick around. And the kids can play with the toys that you have in your library, can read books, while the parents get more of that time to connect with one another. I love the idea. I've never been able to test it. But this, I also wanted to put in this dedicated group that we had coming to the story time became our strongest advocates at the library that we ever had. They were presidents and board members in our friends group and our actual board. They even helped plan programs for events. After a year or two of coming to the story time, they asked us why they couldn't have craft snacks and refreshments for adults. And that was when we developed a program we called Library After Hours. Library After Hours, again, also just began a long time ago. I don't want to think about it, what that time frame is. Again, this was a process born out of the idea of providing a social gathering for adults. We've done everything in this, from crafts like what you see here, making book wreaths, to crock pot taste tests, social gift wrapping, and movie nights for adults. Don't say adult movie nights. That's something completely different and probably something that won't go well in your library. As I mentioned earlier, we felt like we had to step up our game here. They have other obligations in their lives. They may have to find childcare. So you're competing with all of that. One of our first steps was to approach the city council to ask them to change the city code to allow alcohol within the library, which was not an easy ask. I'm not advocating for alcohol use here, but if you want to provide a social group for adults, you kind of have to be accommodating to what some of their gathering processes are. And as you can see here, nobody got drunk. Everybody was just sharing a bottle of wine or, having a hard cider, that sort of thing to enjoy a Friday evening. Friday seemed to work the best. Friday they were kind of in the mood for a release. Saturday they had already gotten involved with home things. Luckily, we had the then city administrator as a participant in the events and who loved them. This was two city administrators ago. He loved it. He'd bring a bottle of wine and just chat with people. I think it was the only time he left his home or his office. So it was one of his favorite things. So we had his backing on that. We did try and make this repetitive, but given the added oomph that we tried to put on it, did falter a bit in the repetition. Also, we found out that we had different people coming to different tasks, so the repetition didn't work quite as well. But what it did allow was groups of friends to come together that didn't have that normal outlet. Remember that we're also talking within the story of isolation as people spending less time with their actual friends. So we did provide this gathering. Small towns in Iowa probably don't have many places for adults to gather other than like a local bar or their homes. And so we tried to become that other place. We did actually have one social community that sprang up from this, and that was our movie night crowd. Since it was simpler and it was more repetitive, able to be more repetitive, the group started looking for it as their social outing. They would make special meals and snacks to bring. They would share wine. Again, they grew together. It did falter during the pandemic. We had a couple of them move away, unfortunately. So that little community that we had kind of dissipated. With these events, I do want to say again, it does require a bit of physical intentionality. If you're doing crafts, you want to think about how to set the table so that people congregate without making it too congested. With our programs, we've had a lot of give and take, a lot of testing that we've done on trying to figure out what works well. If the craft is too simple, people get bored. If it's too tough, people get frustrated and grumpy. It's been taking a lot of trial and error. I don't have a perfect, and it seems to vary by community. So I can't tell you what specifically worked. This paper wreath craft worked really well in West Branch. It was too hard for some reason here in North Liberty. People got a little frustrated. We've broached the topic of having a social hour beforehand so that people can talk, but we haven't tested that yet. It's definitely an idea that we'll take a look at. Bridging many ages. One of the best social groups that we've seen is with knitting and crochet. It has picked up traction with younger adults, in part because of TikTok and Instagram. Again, tossing out social media because everybody's there. And it has for the most part crossed gender stereotypes, if somebody cares about that. This can happen with many hobbies. Knitting and crocheting are some of the more prolific ones, so it's an easy place to start. It also doesn't involve an instructor teaching like yoga or meditation. So it works a little bit well for that. Certain book clubs can work for this, depending on the book group, whether they talk mostly about the book or whether they spend little time about the book. So, that depends on the book discussion or the book club. Here in North Liberty, our knit and crochet group actually began as a library program and then just has taken a life of its own. So it's not actually a library program anymore. They just show up every Tuesday night. I tried to replicate this in West Branch previously, but just didn't have a go of it. Now our group here is actually trying to splinter off into other groups as well, sewing and quilting. And it works really well because it's repetitive and regularity. The regularity of the meetings works really well. We did have luck in West Branch in an instructional process. So having a weekly knitting class where people were learning how to do it. And learning also works pretty well for social discussion. One of the coolest ideas I've heard in this was a beginning knitting group. They made their practice squares because everybody starts knitting or crocheting by making squares. And then they knitted them or the instructor stitched them together to a blanket, and they sold it for a library fundraiser. There's also some nonprofits like Warm Up America, which will ask for segments of knit and crochet and then put them together for warming shelters or for shelters across the country. Um, and again, one of the best parts of these is it requires very little prep, maybe and some snacks and refreshments if you want, but that's about it.
Nick, real quick, we're at about 10 minutes left.
Yes. Yep. I should be getting close here. We also found through the statistics, not just by talking to people, that we have an increasing number of English language learners in our community, up to 10%. Actually, a huge part of our population that we didn't really understand was as big as it was. We have some interaction here with them here at the library, and then a little bit more in our outreach. But it was really through the census data that we found out how large this population was. It's actually over 10% of people don't speak English in their homes. We had somebody ask about a English conversation group. Coming from libraries, I'd never heard of this. I thought that if we wanted to provide a gathering for English language learners, we'd have to provide a class. But this is great too. I mean, this works much better for us and much more geared towards socialization. A conversational group is basically letting people who are learning the language talk in a relaxed and welcoming gathering. Basically, you just pick a topic, provide some snacks and refreshments, and let people talk in English and listen. Normal experiences in English can be high pressure work, doctor's offices, store checkout line with people, like waiting behind you impatiently. This is designed to be the complete opposite. Plus, they'll get to meet other people in the community who are who are new. And one of the most isolating things I can think of, and I think I've said that a couple times now, is moving to a new place where you don't even speak the language and being cut off from the majority of the population by language. For our seniors, I want to say that there's an important distinction here, and that there are two distinct, non-distinct, mushy sets to this population, which I'm going to say is retired empty nesters and then the older retired population, and this can range anywhere from like 55 all the way up to 90 plus. So if you think about people who are 20 years younger than you, you'll probably note that their interests and abilities are far different than yours. So you kind of have to take these as two different subsets. In West Branch, we had a lot of the early retired community, and they can fit really well into your other events, and many do. This group tends to be very active, and depending on what activities are available in and around your community, you may have trouble reaching them because in West Branch they were always on the go. But this is the population that we had for our movie night regulars in West Branch, and for our crochet knitting group here in North Liberty. A lot of the time, you can try and reach this population just by offering some of the same events that work for the young adults during the day. But as people get older, then you have to start considering that they will have a little bit more of a mobility issue, both in terms of traveling as well as physical dexterity. Here we have a lunch that we host every week called the 55 Plus Connections, with some great debate over whether it should be called 55 Plus or Senior Connections. While it is open to anyone over 55, we generally say that anyone under 65 or 70 is going to feel a little alone. Our regular crowd has some people who have turned 90 or 90 plus, so that's a big age difference. It's a great social program, and we have the same regulars who come week after week. It started at about, I think they said about 5-6 people a week, and now they're up to the max that we can fit in the space, which is about 32, I think it is. They generally come early. They've learned in life that dessert should be eaten first, so they usually eat their dessert and then lunch is done, and then there's either a presenter or a bingo, and they love bingo. We have a couple that just comes for bingo. They typically like the historical, the community historical, or the art, social life history, so that they can kind of reminisce about this. Since there's such an interest and we don't have a senior center in town, we're going to be starting a Tuesday morning gathering, which will rotate puzzles one week, games another, book discussion and a craft. We're a little shaky on the book discussion and the craft, just because there wasn't as much interest in those activities. We give them some coffee and donuts and allow them to mostly socialize. You do have to be a little intentional there with the puzzle pieces size, and the crafts don't require a lot of careful dexterity. We talked about hosting some movies, but since you're supposed to not talk during movies, we decided against that. There was a great idea that I found out about. This was again from the book Palaces for the People. In the Brooklyn Public Library system, they have a senior bowling league, which uses video games to play a league across the city. And since it uses virtual controls, they don't have to worry about picking up a ball, especially a bowling ball that's fairly heavy. They even made I can't use the picture because I don't have the rights to it, but they even had their own bowling shirts, which is awesome. And you can find that on a Google search for that Brooklyn Public Library bowling program. And then I'm going to skip this just for time. So these are the references. You can find those on the slides online. If you're interested in this topic, definitely for additional information, check out the Web Junction webinar and read through the advisory, because that's also very interesting. So with that, I hope I've provided some idea and interest and helped foster this interest in you. I think this is also a lot of the basis for the societal disconnect that we have in many issues. So I think this is laying the groundwork for that. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I've turned off chat during the presentation because I get distracted, like I said.
Thanks, Nick. We had a few come in, a few of your former coworkers and coworkers have answered some of them for you. One of the questions was, does the library close for the library after hours? And Jesse told us that yes, indeed, they do. They also asked about providing lunch for the senior lunch program, and Jenny sort of jumped in.
Yes.
But can you tell us a little bit about how that works? Do you serve that lunch? Is it catered? How do you provide that?
So the senior lunch is a actually combo program between us and the recreation side. The library, I guess it's recreation. The city foots half a portion of the bill, but then each participant pays $5 to attend that lunch. And there's a cycle of restaurants around the community that provide the lunches. Some of them are more liked than others. The seniors are very quick to tell you which meals they do not like.
Don't have them back again, please.
Oh, harsher than that. Yeah, there's a gentleman named Frank that's I think 93. One day he walked up to me and was just like, "This meal sucked." Like, I understand, sorry, but yeah. And if they don't have the financial ability to pay the $5 even, they can we can invoice the community pantry and they provide funding for that.
Nice. You also mentioned something called social wrapping or social wraps, and we had a social wrapping question mark. Can you explain that one?
I don't know if anybody else shares the same hatred of gift wrapping that I do, but around Christmas, and this was never a hugely again a huge turnout program, but it was just a social gathering to watch or to wrap gifts together. I think movies were shown sometimes. It works. It works and it doesn't. Again, it's just one of those things. I hate gift wrapping, and many other people hate gift wrapping. We here provide a gift wrapping room, which gets some use. But yeah, it was just a come in and wrap your gifts together.
Nice. The only other one I think that was out there, well, I had actually, before we had any questions come through, I had marked down that one of the stories I still tell when I work with library boards is your whole idea of the after hours and, going to city council and getting the ability to have alcohol after hours.
Yeah.
And that it really was geared towards those newcomers in town who hadn't grown up there, who were trying to find their place to fit
Yeah,
in. And I just think that's such a brilliant way of reaching a population that we don't reach very often. So I still use that as an example as I talk through that. They talked about liquor permits, and what I remember you telling me, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, is that it wasn't so much that you had to go to city council for permitting or anything. It was because there was an ordinance in place that said you couldn't have alcohol on city premises. Is that right?
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so we never dealt with permitting. We required that people bring their own in. They were permitted to bring in beer or wine coolers, which would now be, like, uh, uh, what are those called? Um, the fizzy alcoholic drinks.
Oh yeah.
I can't think what those.
White Claw.
Yes, things like that.
Yeah.
Seltzers.
Yep.
Thank you. Um, no kegs, no hard liquor. They also we did close in part because it was the agreement. It had to be not when the library was open, or else they were concerned about somebody being intoxicated and coming into the library. So it was specifically after hours.
So the only other thing, and I will actually ask Brenda about this first, if she can stick around because she's the room manager right now. Is there anybody who would like to stick around and hear the Dungeons and Dragons story? I would like to, Brenda, if it's all right with you.
Okay, so the Dungeons and Dragons story. Um, so the very first session, I'm like, okay, they make pre-done pre-done campaigns. So they've got all of the creatures set out, the maps, the encounters. And I'm like, okay, well, the first thing we need to do is have each of them talk about their characters and interact and tell them about, who they are in their new identities. And I'm like, okay, well, it's Dungeons and Dragons, so we're gonna have them meet at a tavern, and this is also where they're going to meet the person that hires them, that kind of sets them on this course. And so they're talking to this person, they're talking to one another in this tavern, and I'm like, okay, are you as a dungeon master, I'm like, are you ready to set out? And one of them goes, wait a minute, do we have money? And I'm like, yes, I've given you each, I think it was 50 gold. Um, can I buy ale? I'm like, well, I suppose it's a tavern. You should probably be able to buy ale. He's like, okay, I'm gonna buy three jugs of ale. Um, I'm like, okay, fine. And keep in mind these are teens. They're not kids. So I'm not gonna get into but what happens is he's like, okay, I'm gonna immediately drink an entire cask of ale. I'm like, okay. And so what you do in Dungeons and Dragons is you have every action kind of checked, and I'm like, okay, roll a Constitution check. Um, and he failed it. I'm like, okay, you pass out. So he ends up in the back of this wagon as they're leaving town, passed out, and he spent the entire time of this session just trying to beat this Constitution check to wake up from being passed out. And so they're fighting goblins, and he's still in the back of this wagon. And over time, I'm like, okay, I'm starting to lower it, and his rolls were just awful, and he stayed passed out the whole time. At the end, the other people were just so frustrated that I'm like, we could have really used you in this encounter, and you were passed out. He's like, can we steal his casks of ale? I'm like, well, make a roll for that, and they rolled it successfully. They tossed the ale into the woods. So, and then he tried to check for it, and he failed that. So, yeah, it was one of the most amusing things. He also then the next session, he was the mage because he had some experience, and just decides to pop into a room where it was lined by goblins, just waiting to take shots at him with um, bows and arrows. I'm like, okay, you pop into the room and you see that you're surrounded, and they all shoot arrows, and so he ended up lying on the ground again.
Well, Heidi popped in there and I had written the same thing down, valuable life lesson
Hmm.
learned there.
That's what I'm like. Well, he learned about drinking, heavily
That's right.
drinking during D&D.
People can't depend on you. You'll miss out on all the fun. Sarah posted also escape this podcast. Do you know that one? That was, she said, as something sort of akin
Mhm.
to the D&D stuff.
There are a lot of options out there. Yeah, there's a lot of options out there. I'm not super well versed. As I've said, I've always been interested, but don't actually have any friends that play D&D. So I've never really have, other than hosting that. And it's
But
super
what
fun
a
because you're basically creating your own story, and you can make the world as easy or as difficult for them as you want, and so they can easily overcome. They can overcome obstacles, and you can make sure that they do. So.
there's other things in there. And I'm thinking that's one of the things, as you're talking, going back to the beginning of your session, thinking about combating loneliness, you coming into town, not having this sort of built-in group of friends who did that. So starting it at the library was your
Mhm.
way of overcoming that. I like that. All right, everyone. I've popped the CE thing into chat a couple of times here. This is our last session until later tonight, when we hope you bring your trustees. Brenda, do you have anything else for us? I lost her.